Hi, my name is Dave Spies. I'm at Columbia Breaks Fire Center in Entiat, Washington. And at this center, our main focus is to talk about wildfire because it's a fire interpretive center. And we talk about where fires have happened, when they've happened, and talk about how hot they burn or what kind of destruction they cause. And we talk about human involvement in causing those fires, and also talk about the prevention of fires. And another part of our mission is fire ecology. We want to know how plants and animals deal with fires. And what we need to understand is that wildfire is just as much a part of this east side Cascade environment as the rocks here, the shrubs, the trees, the rattlesnakes, the deer that wander through here. And so that's kind of what we're talking about today. I'm going to take you on a few stops along the trail and talk first about the plants themselves and how they survive in general, and then talk about their relationship to wildfire. I'm walking through a typical ponderosa pine shrub steppe area. It's where mostly you have grasses, shrubs, and then ponderosa pine growing in them. We're in what's called a kind of a transition zone between the low elevation forest and high elevation forest, where there's a bigger variety of trees, less shrubs, and more grass. I'm standing next to a ponderosa pine, and this is one of my favorite trees. And the main reason it's one of my favorite trees is because I consider it a survivor. No matter where I go in the world and I look at plants, I'm always fascinated by how that plant is able to live in the environment in which it's located. They're always adapted or built in some way that makes them able to live in that space and probably not anywhere else. And that's true of a ponderosa pine. It lives in a very harsh environment. Temperatures range from over 100 degrees with frequent droughts, makes it very dry and hot, of course, and to extreme cold temperatures in the wintertime. It also is in an environment that's under constant attack, especially today, attacked by bugs, insects, different diseases. And it lives in competition, even though it doesn't like to, with all the plants that are around it. You look at all the shrubs around here, the grasses, all the other trees, they're all competing for what we call the laws: light, air, water, soil, and here especially water. Ponderosa pine like a lot of light also, so they don't like a lot of competition from other trees. These trees can grow to be 300 to 400 years old. I have one piece of bark I'm going to show you in a little while that's from a tree that's over 800 years old. They can be about 100 feet tall, a little over 100 feet tall. I think the record is 268 feet tall. And they have a very thick bark, which we'll talk about in just a minute. A tree like this starts out in pine cones. The seeds are in pine cones like this. They're about as hard as rocks. The first year, they look like that. They grow on the tree for a little over a year, and then like this August, early September, this cone, the heat will open up these cones. It'll melt the resin that holds the scales together, and the seeds will pop out. You look on the ground here, you can see, thousands of pine cones that have fallen in the past. When they open up like that, the seeds pop out. Okay, when the seeds sprout, they need to be in a location where it's a little bit of moisture so that they can get started. And that's usually between rocks or under the shrub that exist. They need that shade to begin with. And the most successful plants, not just the ponderosa pine, but most of the shrubs in this environment, and need to grow what they call a taproot. See how long that thing is? In the first month, these things can grow 20 inches. And what's the advantage of a taproot? Okay, you notice the ground here? See how dry it is on top? As I get deeper, you can see it gets a little bit darker, and that's where the moisture is. So a plant like this needs to get down to that moisture as quickly as possible. And that's what this plant does. Here are some other examples of taproots on bigger plants. This is an invasive species, but see how long it is? This is one of the flowering plants here. The bottom of the taproot's broken off. And then from the taproot, you have lateral roots that come off and find water that's a little bit more shallow. This one comes off of another type of shrub. That used to be the top of it right there, and you can see the advantage of growing a root like that. Okay, once it gets established, then it needs more sunlight. Let's go look at a couple younger plants over here. Okay, this plant I first showed you is just sprouted this year. It's only a couple months old. You look at this one down here, you can see it found a pretty nice place to grow to begin with. It's between a rock and in the shade of the sagebrush here. This is probably about 3 years old. You look at this one over here, on the other side of the bunch grass, you've got probably one that's 5 or 6 years old. Once they get that size, they're on their way to growing because they probably have a taproot that goes down quite a ways, and they have lateral roots that are stretching out for any kind of moisture they can find. A full-grown pine can send lateral roots out about 100 feet, and that's probably the distance between the big pines that you see here. Distance between that one and those probably about 100 feet. So as you can see, all the roots underground are intertwined with each other. Not only does it help, hold the tree in the ground, but it also creates competition between the trees for the water. We've been talking about the roots. Now, the main purpose of the roots is what? It's to get water up to the leaves of a tree where the food is made. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm not going to answer it because I want you to take the time to research it. We don't have that time here. When you look at how high these ponderosa pines are, how do you think the water gets to the top of the tree? It's almost a miracle that it reaches the top, but there's a mechanism that gets that water to the top, and that's something I'd like you to find out on your own. Now, I will tell you that the water travels up through tubes in the tree that are called xylem. And the xylem's located right under the bark of the tree. And that's what I like to talk about next, is the bark. Normally when you learn about bark of any kind of tree, you ask what its function is. It's to protect the tree. And I ask you, what is it protecting the tree? What part of the tree is it protecting? Well, it's protecting a very thin layer right under it that moves water up the tree, or provides the cells that move water up the tree, and provides cells that move the food back down from the leaves back down the tree. Okay, I'm at a serviceberry bush, and I'm using this one because it has very thin bark on it, so it's easy to show you what that bark is protecting. When I scrape the bark, what color do you see under there mostly? You see kind of a greenish color? Let me show you on this lilac branch that I brought from home. It's a little bit more brilliant. Okay, that layer on the branch or around under the bark on the trunk of a tree is called cambium. That produces two types of cells, xylem and phloem. And I'll show you those words in just a minute. Xylem takes the fluids, the nutrition up the tree. Phloem cells bring the food back down. And this cambium layer here is the one that provides those cells. In fact, when you look at the trunk of a tree, and you look at all the rings of the tree, we'll talk more about that later, the only part that's growing on this trunk of a tree, no matter how big it is that layer right under the bark, the part that I colored green. That's the cambium layer. I showed you what the cambium layer is. Now, what does that cambium layer need to be protected from? Here's one thing right here. See that little bug? It's on the head of a matchstick? That's a pine beetle. And the pine beetle loves cambium. What it does, it drills through the bark and then drills into the cambium and lays its eggs. The eggs hatch into larvae, and the larva starts eating that cambium. Now, here's a trunk that from a dead tree where the bark has fallen off. And you can see the trails that those beetles make. The vertical trails are the ones that the adult beetles made. When the larvae hatch, they make the horizontal trails. It's actually kind of a piece of sculpture in a way. But this is devastating to the tree, simply because if these interrupt the flow of water and nutrients going up the tree, and the food, nutrients coming back down the tree, then it's going to kill the tree. So that's one thing that the bark protects it from, are these beetles. Okay, the other thing that the cambium needs to be protected from is fire. If the cambium is destroyed, the tree is destroyed. If that green ring I showed you under the bark is destroyed, the tree is destroyed. Beetles can do that. The other thing that can do it is fire. So, the ponderosa pine tend to have very thick bark. Look at the bark on this 800-year-old tree. Very rare tree that grows that old. Can you see the layers? It kind of insulates the tree from the cambium from the fire, the heat. The cambium would be right on the inside of the bark right here. My hand wouldn't burn in a fire if it was under a bark like that. The bark is made of, on ponderosa pine, if you look at it, you can see that they're kind of puzzle pieces. In fact, I can flake them off right here. They look like pieces of a puzzle, don't they? They're just kind of loosely held together there. Now let me show you why that's an advantage. You see things starting to pop off of there? Can you hear that crackling? There, see that one pop off? As long as you have sustained heat on the trunk, those little scales that I showed you, those puzzle pieces, start popping off. Can you understand why that would be an advantage in a fire? Okay, as we turn the heat off, you can see that the trunk stops burning, the bark stops burning. So the ponderosa pine has a very thick trunk that protects it from both the beetles and from fire. There's one other thing that a ponderosa pine, a mature one, does that protects it from fire. If you look at what do you notice about most of the trunk? You look at all the other old pines around here, you have the same thing. You don't have any branches growing on the lower trunk. Now, why would that be an advantage? Well, because the only way you can kill this ponderosa pine, the only way fire can kill this ponderosa pine is if it gets up into the needles. And the needles are actually just a different shaped leaf that you find in other trees, and that's where the food is made. If those needles die, if more than a third of those needles die, then you probably lose the tree. Now, fire doesn't burn up the trunk very well, so how can it get up into the needles? Now we're getting to the part that help you understand why our problems are a mess in some places. See that grove of trees over there? Those are young ponderosa pine, very successful right now. And we got two problems with them. When you have that many trees growing together, they become weak. And when they become weak, they become diseased. And they are more susceptible to beetle attacks. Now, the reason they're more susceptible to beetle attacks is that when a beetle pokes through the bark into the cambium, resin pours out, which we call pitch. And that can drown the bug or trap it there and prevent it from getting inside and laying its eggs. Now, if there's too many beetles attacking the tree and there's not enough water for that tree to produce that resin or to keep that tree healthy, because there's so much competition, there's so many trees growing in one place, then the beetles eventually win. And in the end, if you end up having a whole forest full of dead trees, which makes really high intensity fires that are really destructive. Now, the other problem we have with these trees growing next to the big ones is that they act as ladder fuel. The fire sweeps through the pine needles, the grasses, grows into the shrubs, grows into the smaller trees, climbs the smaller trees, which are sticking into the older trees. And if the small trees go, then the big tree will go in the next fire. So that's a problem with our forest. We have too many trees. Once what we experience is, or somebody said is an epidemic of trees. Too many trees, creating too much competition for the light, air, water, soil, and creating whole dead forests that are susceptible to really hot fires. Another problem with groves of trees this thick is you notice the forest floor under the trees covered with pine needles, and you don't see any grasses growing. Pine trees like a lot of space between them, and fires used to come through and burn these small trees, or most of them that couldn't survive the fire. And that left enough space, open space, for grasses to grow, for sunlight to get in to make the bigger trees healthier, and for small shrubs and for small grasses to grow.